In the heart of a relentless winter, one mountain man faced a bitter cold that would have broken most men. But his solution to survival wasn't just about toughening up, it was about rethinking everything. What he built would not only save his life, but revolutionize cabin construction forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If you love survival stories like this one, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode takes you deeper into the untold tales of the American frontier. The winds howled like wolves in the distance, swirling snow and ice into every crack and corner of the mountain range. Samuel Bridger had been through many winters in the Rockies, but none like this. As the first gusts of wind slammed against the cabin, he knew that the storm would be the start of something far worse than anyone could predict. The season ahead would test not only his skills, but his very will to survive. He stood near the window, watching the horizon disappear under a blanket of white. The fire in the hearth crackled, struggling to keep the cold at bay. Samuel's thick beard caught the frost that had blown in through the smallest of gaps in the logs, but he didn't mind. The cold had become part of his skin, his bones, his soul. His thick coat, layered with furs, kept him warm enough for now. But the cabin he'd built with his own hands, a mere 4 walls stacked high with logs, offered no real protection against the harsh elements. It had worked for a while, but that was before this storm. Samuel had always prided himself on his survival skills, honed over the years of trapping beaver and living in the wilderness. But this winter, it wasn't the cold or the wolves that worried him, it was the bear. He could hear its growls in the distance, as if it too was preparing for the coming storm. He knew that the grizzly bears that roamed these lands could tear through a man's cabin with little effort, and for the first time, Samuel questioned whether his simple log cabin would be enough to withstand one of them. The storm raged on outside, but Samuel's thoughts wandered back to a simpler time, when he was just a boy learning the ways of the wilderness. He remembered his father's teachings on shelter, the importance of shelter, the way it could mean the difference between life and death. But now, as the wind whipped through the trees, he understood the lesson in a way he never had before. The cabin was too weak. If a bear came this way, it would rip through it like paper. The thought haunted him as he turned back toward the fire. He needed a solution, something that would give him peace of mind. But that solution was not going to come easy. By the time the storm had passed, the sun was a dim, pale orb hanging low on the horizon, barely making an impression on the heavy snow. Samuel stood outside his cabin, feeling the weight of the winter still in the air. The cold was biting, more so than it had been the day before. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, his mind focused not on the landscape but on the memory of what had happened just days ago. It was early spring when Samuel had lost his partner John Hoffman to a grizzly. It happened so quickly, so violently, that Samuel could barely recall the exact moments after the first shot rang out. He had been working inside the cabin when the sound of gunfire sliced through the stillness of the forest. 3 shots in rapid succession, and then, nothing. Samuel had grabbed his rifle and rushed toward the sounds of distress. He found John a mile from their camp, the bear's massive claws already having done their damage. The grizzly had struck quickly, its sharp claws tearing into John's flesh before he could fire off a second shot. The animal's brutal efficiency left John with no chance to survive. Samuel buried his partner by the creek, the snow already falling on the grave. The loss was still fresh, and the bitterness lingered. But there was no time for mourning. The wilds didn't allow for grief to take root. He had to return to the cabin and figure out what went wrong. As Samuel stood at the edge of the creek, looking out at the wilderness around him, a realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The cabin, the very thing that had been his supposed protection, had failed him. It had failed John. The flimsy door, the weak corners, the gaps in the walls, all of it was no match for the power of a grizzly bear. The loss of his partner had brought Samuel to a cold truth. Survival wasn't just about toughness, it was about smart design. He wasn't just a trapper anymore. He was a builder now, and he needed to build something that could withstand even the most brutal forces of nature. That night, Samuel sat up long after the fire had burned low, tracing in his mind the many things he would need to do to fortify the cabin. He would need to rethink everything, the materials, the structure, the very design of his shelter. No more settling for the same old methods. His focus shifted entirely to survival, and the legacy of his partner's death would fuel every decision moving forward. He wouldn't let this wilderness take any more from him. The snow had settled into a silent, heavy blanket over the land by the time Samuel returned to his cabin in the early days of summer. His journey to Street Louis had been long, the trails hard and unforgiving, but it gave him time to think. The echoes of John's death still haunted him, but now they were mingling with a new obsession: how to make a cabin that could withstand anything. Samuel had spent weeks in the city, watching carpenters and builders at work, noting their techniques with a quiet intensity that most people dismissed. He wasn't an educated man. He had no formal training in construction or architecture, but what he had was an unwavering will and practical experience. He'd learned to build with his hands, not with blueprints. And now he had a new project, one that would change everything. As Samuel rode back into the mountains, he thought about the weak spots in the cabins he had seen over the years, the corners that settled, the doors that couldn't withstand the pressure, the gaps that let in the cold and the wild. He had seen enough to know that no amount of grit or experience could overcome the weaknesses built into these structures. The frontier men had their tools in their hands, but they had no engineering. Back at his camp, Samuel began to prepare. He had gathered strange supplies for a trapper: iron brackets, square-cut nails, a thick roll of canvas, and tools he had never seen before. Other trappers had laughed at him when they saw the weight of his pack iron was too expensive, canvas too heavy, nails too impractical for the backcountry. But Samuel knew better. He understood something they didn't. It wasn't just about survival, it was about creating something lasting, something that wouldn't break when the world pressed down on it. Samuel began the construction of his new cabin on a slight rise, away from the creek, as far from the floodwaters and bears as he could manage. He didn't care about convenience or speed. The cabin wouldn't be done in 4 days. It wouldn't be built with haste. It would be built to last. The logs he selected were straight, thick, and uniform, no irregular shapes or tapering. He stripped the bark from each one, even though it made the job harder. The bark would leave gaps, and gaps meant weakness. The logs had to fit together with precision, a puzzle that could withstand the harshest elements and the strongest forces. As he worked, Samuel noticed a shift in himself. The obsessive focus that had gripped him since John's death had taken hold in a way he hadn't expected. He no longer saw just logs and tools. He saw the future. This cabin was not just a place to sleep, it was a fortress. Every joint, every corner, every piece of wood had a purpose. His mind raced with calculations and measurements, pushing him to work even harder, even longer. But the work was slow. Too slow for most of the men around him. The trappers would come by and mock him, calling his efforts a waste of time. "You'll never survive the winter building like that," they'd tell him. But Samuel only nodded in reply, his mind too consumed to care for their opinions. They didn't understand. They never would. He was building not just for himself, but for a future where no man would ever have to worry about the wilderness breaking him. By the time autumn rolled around, Samuel's cabin had begun to take form. It was different from any other structure in the mountains, strong, deliberate, and meticulously constructed. The corners were reinforced with iron pins, a technique he had seen in stone construction but never applied to logs. The roof was layered thick with birch bark, clay, and sod, far stronger and more waterproof than the typical pine boughs and bark most trappers used. It was slow, painstaking work. Each log had to be cut precisely, and no log could be too curved or warped. Samuel wasn't in a rush. This wasn't just about shelter, it was about innovation. A fortress in the wild. Samuel spent most of his days cutting logs, stripping bark, and assembling the pieces. He had learned to craft with a focus that no one around him seemed to understand. While other trappers hunted, fished, and spent their time in the pursuit of immediate rewards, Samuel worked with his mind on the long term. He measured every log, shaped every corner, and made sure every joint fit perfectly. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, Samuel took a step back to assess his progress. The cabin had walls now, the foundation was set, and the roof was nearly complete. But what struck him was how different it looked, not just in structure, but in spirit. The work he had done had transformed the wilderness around him. He no longer felt like a victim of the wild. He felt like he was shaping the land itself, carving his future into the earth. Yet, there were still moments of doubt. As the winter storm picked up speed, Samuel wondered if this new structure would truly hold. The cold wind whistled through the trees, and the snow began to accumulate thickly. He could hear the howls of wolves in the distance, the deep growls of the grizzly bears that had been more aggressive this year. Still, Samuel didn't stop. He couldn't. The thought of retreating back to the old way of doing things, building a cabin just to survive the winter, was no longer enough for him. His focus had shifted. This was more than survival now. This was about legacy. That night, as the storm grew harsher, Samuel sat by the fire inside the half-built cabin, watching the snow pile high against the walls. He could hear the wind howling outside, but inside, he felt a sense of peace. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the wilderness. His work had begun to take on a life of its own. The storm outside raged, but inside, Samuel was finally building something that could stand against it. The legacy of survival wasn't about fighting the wilderness, it was about understanding it and building something that could endure it. He was no longer just surviving, he was becoming part of the land itself. The first true test of Samuel's cabin came earlier than expected. It was late October when the winds began their assault on the mountains, bringing with them a bitter cold that gnawed at the skin and soul. Samuel knew the storm was coming. He could feel it in the wind, the way the air seemed to stiffen with anticipation. But nothing had prepared him for the force of nature that would hit in the coming days. Inside the cabin, Samuel had built his fire as usual, the stone hearth crackling with warmth. The walls, thick with layers of clay and horsehair chinking, stood firm. No drafts seeping through the cracks. The roof, reinforced with layers of birch bark and sod, held up against the weight of the snow. It was nearly perfect. Samuel stood by the window, watching the first flakes fall gently to the ground. But as the night deepened, the storm intensified. By the morning, the wilderness was unrecognizable. Snow piled high against the cabin, nearly obscuring the door. The wind screamed through the trees, bending them almost to the breaking point. Samuel felt the weight of the storm pressing against the walls, but there was no sense of panic. His cabin stood resolute. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress. But he wasn't alone in the wilderness. The wolves had returned, drawn by the scent of the storm. Samuel could hear their howls in the distance, wild and desperate, but the sound that chilled him the most was the low growl of a bear. It was close. The grizzly had been circling for days, and now, with the storm settling in, it was only a matter of time before the bear would test the strength of Samuel's cabin. Samuel stood by the gun ports he had installed into the walls, his rifle resting on the sill. The wind howled, but his mind was calm. He had designed the cabin for moments like this, moments when nature tested a man's resolve. It was the ultimate test of his work. Would the corners hold? Would the door withstand the pressure? Would the grizzly find a weakness? As the day wore on, Samuel could hear the bear approaching, its massive body moving through the deep snow. It wasn't just wandering, it was probing. The animal moved slowly, methodically, inspecting every inch of the cabin as if it had learned from its previous encounters with men. The bear's claws scraped against the thick logs, searching for a weak point, a flaw. But nothing gave. The door remained intact, the corners held firm. Even the small window, high on the wall, was secure. Hours passed as Samuel remained in place, watching through the gun ports. The bear circled for what felt like an eternity, but it could find no way in. Finally, the animal, frustrated and exhausted by its efforts, wandered off into the storm. Samuel lowered his rifle, his breath slow and steady. It wasn't just the bear that had been tested today. His cabin had proven its worth. The storm, the wolves, and the grizzly had all come to challenge him, but in the end, it was Samuel's construction that had held firm. It wasn't perfect, there would always be more to learn, more to refine, but for the first time in his life, Samuel felt a deep, overwhelming sense of satisfaction. He had built something that could stand up to the wilderness, something that could protect him against nature's wrath. As the winter deepened, Word of Samuel's cabin spread quietly through the trapping community. The men who had mocked him for his slow, meticulous work now looked at his fortress with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Samuel didn't care for their praise. He wasn't building for them, he was building for his survival. But even he couldn't deny that there was a certain sense of pride in the way the other trappers regarded him now. They'd been curious at first, coming to inspect the structure during their travels, asking questions about how he had managed to reinforce the door or what he had used for chinking. Some men laughed at his jail cell, as they had called it, but others, more practical men, asked for his advice. How had he achieved such stability? What made the cabin so strong? Could they do it themselves? Samuel, ever the quiet man, shared his knowledge freely. He wasn't trying to become a teacher, and he certainly didn't want to be known as a genius. But as the months passed and more trappers stopped by, his innovations slowly began to catch on. Some men, seeing the effectiveness of Samuel's construction, started building their own cabins with similar techniques. It was a slow process, but the idea was spreading. One evening, a trapper named William Marshall stopped by, his face weathered and drawn from the cold. He had heard of Samuel's cabin and had come to see it for himself. He was skeptical at first, but after a long conversation with Samuel and a thorough inspection of the cabin, Marshall's doubts faded. He asked if Samuel would be willing to help him rebuild his own cabin, which had been destroyed by a bear during the previous winter. Samuel agreed. He didn't see it as a favor to Marshall. He saw it as an opportunity to prove that his design could work on a larger scale. And so, over the course of the next week, the two men worked together, building a new cabin using Samuel's methods. The cabin took longer than Marshall had expected, but by the time they finished, it was something entirely different from the cabin he had originally built. When Marshall returned to his trapline, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his new home. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress, designed to withstand the elements, to keep out the predators, and to protect a man's life. Word spread, slowly at first, then more quickly as other trappers began to adopt Samuel's techniques. The Bridger-style cabin, as it would come to be known, became a symbol of survival and ingenuity. Samuel didn't care for the name, but he knew that his work had made a difference. The other trappers would be safer. The wilderness had always been harsh, but now, with Samuel's innovations, it was just a little bit less deadly. As the winter continued, Samuel worked in solitude, his thoughts focused on the next steps in his evolution as a builder. But even in the isolation, he could feel the weight of his legacy growing. It was no longer just about survival. It was about changing the frontier. He had built a better future, one log at a time. As the days grew shorter and the snow piled higher, Samuel continued to perfect his cabin building techniques, refining his methods with each new structure he helped construct. It was the middle of winter when the next test came, not from the elements or the animals, but from a different kind of threat, the encroachment of human settlement. Trappers and settlers, moving westward in search of fortune and new lands, began to filter through the region. Most were curious about the wild frontier, but there was a growing interest in Samuel's designs. The fur trade was fading, and the wilderness, which had been the domain of rugged men like Samuel, was slowly opening up to new, more permanent inhabitants. As word spread about Samuel's ingenuity, settlers began arriving at his doorstep, asking for advice on building shelters, constructing cabins that could protect their families from the harsh winters that lay ahead. At first, Samuel had been hesitant. He was a solitary man, and the intrusion of outsiders into his world felt intrusive. He had never been one. For socializing or teaching, his focus had always been survival. But over time, he saw the writing on the wall. These settlers weren't just passing through. They were here to stay. With each visit, Samuel was drawn deeper into the world of community building. The settlers had the resources and the manpower to spread his methods far and wide, but it was up to him to show them how to do it. Despite his natural inclination to withdraw from the world, Samuel began to realize that this was the next phase of his life. His knowledge, his survival skills, could benefit others. If the techniques he had developed helped these settlers build homes that would withstand the dangers of the wilderness, they could help ensure a future for generations to come. Though Samuel remained quiet about his personal motivations, There was a sense of fulfillment in his work. Each cabin he helped build, each lesson he taught, added another layer to the growing legacy of his survival methods. The small, tight-knit trapping community began to evolve, and Samuel's innovations became integral to its survival. But there was still much to be done. Winter passed, and as the spring thawed the earth, Samuel's mind was filled with new ideas. Could he improve his designs further? Could he make his cabins even more resilient? He had always worked alone, but now, with the settlers growing more dependent on his expertise, Samuel began to see the value in collaboration. One day, a settler named Thomas came to him with a new idea. What if we built a structure that not only withstands bears and snow, but can hold up against fire too? Thomas had lived in the area for years, and he had seen how quickly a fire could destroy everything in its path. Samuel was intrigued. The thought hadn't crossed his mind before, but now it seemed like the next logical step. Together, they began discussing ways to improve the construction, adding fire-resistant materials into the mix. It was this spirit of innovation, of combining old-world knowledge with new ideas, that would shape the future of frontier living. As the seasons changed and the frontier began to expand, Samuel saw that his work had not only made him a respected figure in the wilderness, but had also become a blueprint for future settlers. The Bridger-style cabins were no longer a secret confined to the trapping community. They had become the foundation of a new way of living on the frontier, one that balanced the raw power of nature with the ingenuity of human design. And Samuel, once a solitary man, had unknowingly become one of the architects of the frontier's future. Years passed, and Samuel continued to live quietly in his cabin, but his reputation had long since outgrown the mountain wilderness. Word of his construction methods spread far beyond the trapping community and into the broader frontier. By the time the settlers arrived in greater numbers, Samuel's cabins had already begun to take root in the region. Samuel had never been one to seek recognition, and yet his name became synonymous with durability and survival. The Bridger-style cabins became the gold standard for frontier homes, structures built to stand up to the harshest winters, the fiercest storms, and the most determined predators. Even the local native tribes had taken note, observing how these cabins seemed to withstand the test of time in ways their own shelters never had. Despite the growing attention and interest, Samuel never sought fame. He continued to live the life he had always known, hunting, trapping, and working the land. But he couldn't ignore the changes that were happening all around him. The once quiet wilderness was becoming a battleground of sorts, a place where new settlers fought for land and survival. The isolation he had once craved was being replaced by a growing sense of connection to something much larger than himself. One afternoon, as he was out gathering firewood, Samuel came across a small family struggling to make do in a poorly built cabin. The father, a young man named Jacob, had been using the same traditional techniques Samuel had once relied on, and the results were disastrous. The cabin was drafty and unstable, the door barely hanging on its hinges, and the roof was already beginning to leak. It was clear that Jacob's family would not make it through the winter in such a shelter. Samuel approached the family with the same quiet, measured steps he always took. Jacob, seeing the familiar face, greeted him with a mixture of hope and hesitation. "I've heard stories about your cabins," Jacob said, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and desperation. "I never thought I'd get the chance to meet you, but I was hoping you might help us. We've tried everything we can, but this place won't hold up." Samuel nodded, his mind already running through the details. He could see the potential, the need for his help. But this time, it wasn't about simply offering advice. He knew that the structure of this cabin would need to be rebuilt entirely. The stakes were high. Jacob's family couldn't afford another winter without proper shelter. "Let me help you," Samuel said simply, his voice calm but firm. "We'll rebuild it. We'll make sure you're ready." And so, they began again. Samuel and Jacob worked side by side, teaching the next generation of settlers how to build not just a shelter, but a fortress against the unforgiving wilderness. The task was daunting, but as the days passed, Samuel's methods began to show their worth once again. By the time the winter came, Jacob's family was safe, surrounded by the strength and stability of the Bridger-style cabin. The lessons Samuel had taught were no longer just about survival. They had become a way of life, a way to thrive in a world that was constantly testing the limits of human resilience. The frontier was changing, but Samuel had built a legacy that would endure for generations. The cabins he had crafted were not just shelters, they were symbols of the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the final days of winter pressed down on the Rockies, Samuel felt a quiet shift inside himself. His body, once sharp and driven by survival, had begun to show the marks of time. The long, harsh winters, the laborious work of building and refining his cabins, had taken their toll. His hands, once nimble with the tools of construction, now trembled slightly. The weight of the years hung on his bones, and he knew that this would be his last winter on the mountain, but there was no bitterness in the knowledge, no regret. Samuel had built something far greater than a cabin. He had built a legacy, a way of life that had touched the very heart of the frontier. His cabins had become symbols of strength, of protection, of enduring through the toughest trials nature could throw at a man. And as the days passed and the snows began to melt, he felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his work would last long after he was gone. He had never cared for fame or wealth, never sought recognition. He had only ever wanted survival, the security of knowing that the wilderness could not break him. And now, his cabins stood as proof of that truth, strong, unyielding, and tested by time. They had saved lives, kept families safe, and protected the men who had come to trust in their strength. In the evenings, as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, Samuel would sit by the hearth, staring into the flames. He didn't need to speak anymore. His work had already spoken for him. The settlers, the trappers, and the families who had built their homes on the foundation of his designs would carry his legacy forward. It was a quiet end to a life that had been anything but quiet. The cabin stood firm against the storms, just as it had all those years ago when Samuel had first set out to build something that could withstand the wilderness. And as the last snowflakes of winter fell, Samuel knew that he had done what he set out to do. He had survived, and in doing so, he had ensured that others would too. The spring thaw brought with it a new chapter, one that Samuel would never live to see fully. In the years that followed his final winter, his cabins continued to stand tall against the elements, silent monuments to the man who had built them. New settlers arrived, and old trappers passed on, but the legend of Samuel Bridger's cabins only grew. As the fur trade faded and the gold rush took its place, the cabins that Samuel had crafted became more than just shelters. They became the symbol of frontier ingenuity and resilience. They were proof that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, a man could build something that would outlast him. His cabins, still standing strong on the mountainsides and plains, became a part of the land itself. Though Samuel had never sought recognition, his work spoke louder than words. By the time the railroad reached the west, the Bridger-style cabin had become the benchmark for frontier construction. The settlers who came after him, those who built their homes using his techniques, never knew his name. They never heard the story of the man who had built something to last. But they lived in the safety of his work, and that was enough for them. Samuel passed away quietly in Oregon in 1871, far from the mountains that had shaped him. He had found peace, and with it a sense of fulfillment. He had given the wilderness one final gift, a legacy of survival and strength that would endure for generations. His grave, marked by a simple stone, bore no mention of the cabins he had built or the impact he had made. To his family, he was simply a rancher, a man who had lived a good life. But to those who knew the mountains and the wilderness, Samuel Bridger's legacy was etched into every cabin, every log, every corner where the wilderness could not break through. And that was enough.